Hi, my name is Jeremiah Robison, founder and CEO of CIONIC. We build bionic clothing that can analyze and augment human movement, enabling the body to move with more freedom and control. Welcome to another episode of our podcast, Superpowering the Human Body, where we explore the science and technology of human ability and augmentation. Today on the show, I'm joined by Dr. Richard Zorowitz, Chief Medical Informatics Officer and attending physician at MedStar National Rehabilitation Hospital and Professor of Clinical Rehab Medicine at Georgetown University School of Medicine, both in Washington, D.C. And Dr. Zorowitz, thanks for joining us today. You have an impressive set of credentials and career. I'm just going to read through a few of them for our audience, and then we'll jump into questions. Dr. Zorowitz has been researching stroke rehabilitation outcomes in dysphagia, spasticity, and hemiplegic shoulder. He has published articles in peer-reviewed journals and written chapters about stroke rehabilitation in international papers and books. He has participated on consensus panels of the Joint Commission for Primary Stroke Centers and the Commission on Accreditation of Rehab Facilities in the Stroke Specialty Program. He is a chair of Rehabilitation and Recovery Committee of the American Stroke Association Stroke Council, and also serves as a member of the Innovative Practices and Payment Models Committee of the American Academy of Physical Medicine and Rehab. Wow, that's a whole lot of contribution to this world, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate your invitation.
So you're a board certified physical medicine and rehabilitation doctor, spinal cord injury medicine and brain injury medicine. That's a unique and holistic view of stroke and stroke motor recovery. Can you speak a little bit about how all those disciplines interplay in your practice?
So let me start by telling you that physical medicine rehab, we describe ourselves sort of as functional and quality of life doctors. I mean, we're here to try to get patients as functional and as independent, whether it has to do with things that I do with brain injury, spinal cord injury, and stroke, as well as my other colleagues, which sometimes deal with some of the more musculoskeletal things that we see. But the thing that really brings us all together is the whole idea of function and trying to build quality of life. So we are a very holistic specialty, and the reason why is, one, because we don't really focus on one body system. I mean, we're not a gastroenterologist, we're not a nephrologist. I mean, we really deal with the entire person. So when we do that, we're dealing with first the physical aspects of it, trying to get people as functional as possible with walking, with either bathing, feeding, grooming themselves. But in addition to that, we deal with language and cognitive aspects of that and how that plays into function as well. So that can be patients who have speech problems such as aphasia or apraxia, or the cognitive issues such as memory and attention issues or executive functioning. So we have to look at all that stuff and try to put that all together. In addition to that, we also look at the psychological aspects of disability. Many patients who have strokes or spinal cord injuries or brain injuries, can become depressed, they can become anxious, they can really have some of those issues. So we have to look at these issues and bring in the resources to be able to deal with these patients as well. And then finally, we need to deal with also the psychosocial thing, because it's not just the patient that we're dealing with. We're dealing with everybody around the patient, and especially with stroke, or some of these other things, we have to worry about caregivers, because if a caregiver can't advocate for themselves, it's going to be very hard for them to take care of the patient. And if the caregiver can't care for the patient, they're both going to languish. And so put that all together, it's a very, very complicated but integrated way of practicing medicine. But it is truly holistic in that we really have to look at the whole person and what goes on around that person.
Absolutely. Yeah, you talk in your research and some of your published works about early access and comprehensive personalized care. Can you describe both of those components, the early access component as well as the personalization, and what is the best practices for creating a personalized rehabilitation program for a stroke survivor?
So for a stroke survivor, we try to get rehab going as early as possible. I'm not going to go with all the literature that's involved with it, but just to suffice to say that we really start with rehab really after the first 24 hours. I really love to say, that the neurologist gets the first 24 hours, we get the rest of their lives.
Right.
So you really want to try to start doing rehab in the acute care hospital, which is really getting the patient out of bed, getting them mobilized. But then really the very important aspect of this is trying to evaluate that patient and make decisions on how and where are the best places to take care of those patients. And so an evaluation is really very, very key. And that again is the physical aspects of it. It's the psychological, it's the cognitive and language, as well as the psychosocial, because the patient who is not going to have the support to be able to go home eventually may not be able to go home eventually. So we have to really look at those things very carefully. At the same time, we want to make sure that patients get the appropriate care that they need. So by doing a really comprehensive evaluation, we can make sure either they can go to an acute rehab, whether they go to a skilled nursing facility, or whether they can go directly home and have home care or outpatient. And that's really very important because there is some literature that actually suggests that patients do slip through the cracks and may actually be discharged home when they probably could have benefited from some sort of an inpatient type of setting. So we want to try to make sure that that happens. In terms of the treatment, treatment also has to be somewhat individualized, which is a good thing because, basically, as I love to say, when you've seen one stroke or a brain injury or a spinal cord injury, you've seen one of those. Everybody is different and has to be treated individually. And so the idea of making sure that those problems are identified and that those are treated appropriately with the therapist that you need is going to be really key to maximizing that person's outcome. And the interesting part of all of this is that the literature really suggests that not necessarily one treatment is better than another, which in reality is really a good thing. Because of the fact that we can choose things just like you choose off a Chinese menu is my analogy to that. You can choose from column A and column B, and and get a program together with the idea that you want to get that patient to engage in what they're doing, and then do lots of it, because by doing that, that's going to help reorganize the brain and get that brain to work as efficiently and as maximally as they possibly can. So by getting the evaluation, getting an individualized treatment plan, and then really getting that initialized plan in action really makes a huge difference, and that will allow the patient, to ultimately get to their maximum level of function.
I love that you used the phrase that you said about meeting one stroke patient. We had to say the same thing. You meet one child. My daughter with cerebral palsy, you've met exactly one child with cerebral palsy, and everybody is unique and individual. And for her, that engagement, finding different ways in which she engages in her treatment. She does dance, for instance, because it's something she really loves. It doesn't feel like therapy, but it has amazing therapeutic benefits and is increasing her strength, balance, and range of motion. So finding things that really engage the person, it's just so key.
No, absolutely. And I think we even on the inpatient side make use of recreational therapists who, can take things like dance, take music, take, playing board game or whatever, and you can actually take all those things, and when you break them down, you can actually break them down into functional activities, whether it's cognitive or physical, that will allow that patient, hopefully to flourish over time.
You talk about the psychological aspects of stroke and brain injury. And one of my questions is, what are some of the misconceptions that people have, either people who have just had a stroke or people who surround them in the community, about stroke survivors and what's possible?
I think probably the misconception is that, that you at least, can't maintain, what you have, or can't get better. I mean, the literature has really suggested that months or even years, there is the potential. And I really emphasize the idea that it is potential, because I'll be very realistic. Not everybody necessarily does get better, but the idea that with hard work after that stroke, they can maximize and hopefully build on whatever skills that they are learning over a period of time, to be able to maximize their function. Some other misconceptions, I think, especially in terms of like aphasia, for example. Language is really probably a big thing, because most people will think, may talk to a patient who's aphasic. They may talk loud, and and it's like, no, it's not a matter that they, it's not the matter they can't hear. It's just that they have a problem processing. And so sometimes you may have to talk a little bit more slowly, or repeat yourself, and really engage with that person to make sure that they're understanding. So that's another aspect of things that we have to look at as well. And the other thing too is that when we can, some families, may decide, okay, this patient really can't do a lot, so we're going to do everything for them. And the idea of rehab is to try to get the patient as independent as they possibly can be. So really, the concept really is going to be meet them halfway. Let them do what they can do, and then if they really cannot do something, that's when you jump in and help them complete that activity.
Yeah, and there was a disability advocate who said the best approach that she had heard was, how can I help you do the thing you're already doing? Like, how can I want to recognize that you are already doing this, and if I can be helpful, great. If I can't, if it's better that I'm not, but just that acknowledgement is key.
Right. And I think the idea, for us, the idea really is that we're here to be cheerleaders. And you don't want to be critical, because that patient really, may not be able to do the kinds of things, but you try to cheer them on to get them to do what they can be able to do, and then help them out, along the way.
Yeah, I was thinking of one other misconception that I've seen within disability, and that is that oftentimes there is an assumption that with a physical difference and a physical impairment, there is also a cognitive impairment. And especially we've seen this with our daughter, who is, highly verbal and very engaged, that they're surprised when they see her in a walker or using her canes, that she doesn't have a cognitive impairment that goes along with that. So.
No, and that's another, I mean, certainly that's another thing, but I think then you have the other side, there's another side, and that is for some of the patients who do have cognitive impairments. I think, a lot of people will sort of call that the invisible impairment, because you look at that person and they'll say, oh, they look perfectly normal. Right. But, if they're not remembering, or if they can't pay attention to things, that's a major problem. And sometimes people, don't acknowledge that and can't really, help patients with some of those things. So those are things that we have to be aware of as well.
You talked earlier about meeting patients halfway, and I guess it's on everybody's mind, the pandemic, and it's been especially interesting. I think it has been very challenging for people with disabilities, as well as driving some awareness of the inability for us to go and see and do things with our friends, that may actually be the reality for people who have a disability all the time. Do you think there are some silver linings to what has happened with the pandemic in terms of shift of working and accommodations for telemedicine and virtual healthcare?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number. I mean, there's good things and there's been bad things. I've heard somebody talk a couple of months ago about simple things like being able to get out to the community and go shopping. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the negative, and then and then I will answer that. But for example, we had one person who spoke to us about the idea of not being able to go out and go shopping, and suddenly having to be dependent upon the community to get stuff into the house, and how difficult that actually was.
Mm.
And especially when that person was capable to some degree of getting out to the community, suddenly has to really depend on the community to help them out. So, so as those things get going, I think that's a nice thing. On the other hand, to get to some of the positive things that you've asked about, I think in terms of work, the silver lining, I think, has been this whole shift of being able to work from home. Some of my patients will literally tell me how nice it actually has been, not to have to worry about the commute, and if they are dependent on, we have Metro Access here in the DC area, which is our disability ride, and basically, not having to worry about having to make those appointments and get that stuff, because they can do it at home and they can work, right from their home. So so I think where some people are going crazy, some people are very, very thankful, that they can actually, be able to stay home. And I think the advantage to that for those patients is that they at least have, the ability, one, to work remotely, number two, to have really the accommodations, because literally whatever they have at home, which is their accommodations, they can make use of, rather than, again, having to ask for that kind of stuff at work. So whether they need, for example, say speech to text software, or or text to speech software for that matter, they can have they can have that stuff, because usually that stuff's going to be right there on their own, in their own settings. So I think there are some nice things that have happened, and my patients again have sort of asked me, when we start getting back into reality, can I get a letter from you to be able to continue doing this? And I'm certainly willing to support all that stuff, so we can keep our patients as productive as they can be.
Yeah, I had read a somewhat depressing stat that since the ADA was passed, several decades ago, the percentage of the disabled that are still in the workforce has not significantly increased. And my hope is that with this virtualization of work, the ability to work from anywhere, that you really start to see a shift. People are able to, because I think work is important. I think your contribution to society is how we often value ourselves. So the ability to increase that percentage, I think, would be a huge, huge win out of what has been a really struggling time for everyone.
No, and I totally agree with that. I think that, but I think at the same time, making sure that, accommodations that can be, approved and applied for, by ADA is very important. I mean, up to this point, we've sometimes had, we've had plenty of issues of patients who have, whose employers have not always been very cooperative in terms of doing that. So I'm hoping that, maybe going forward, doing more, telework and stuff will, help to maybe solve some of those problems.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's shift gears a second and talk about caregivers. You mentioned it early in this conversation, the socioeconomic burden, the psychological burden on caregivers. What can we do better to account for that, to support those people and give them the assets they need to care for what's often their family and friends?
So caregiving is probably one of the most difficult things that I think, that needs to be addressed. I think in terms of how is it accounted for, it's hard. I mean, very seriously, it's hard, because how do you account for it? The number of hours that somebody may have to go into. It's not like you punch your clock in and from 9 o'clock to 5, and then at 5 you can punch your clock out. I mean, it is usually a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week endeavor. and sometimes a very a very significant one. I mean, if you can imagine, a stroke survivor, I had a guy, in today, I don't know, he's got to be at least a couple 100 pounds, and his wife takes care of him. And, being able to have to transfer, so lifting 200 pounds every time you have to do something like that, I mean, is a major thing. And it puts, caregivers at risk. So not only it's the hours, but also the physical demands. And the problem is, of course, there is no job description for a caregiver. I mean, It's really everything as, as directed or, as needed. And that's, really what you have to do. So in terms of being able to support, again, we start a lot, right from the get-go. And when patients come into acute rehab, for example, I mean, we'll really talk to them from the social work standpoint in terms of what's going on and, who's at home to help you. Or do you have the financial resources if you need to hire somebody? And so sometimes that's a major effort because families may have to really come together so you get several people. Because again, as I said early on, if if a caregiver cannot advocate for themselves, they're in trouble and the patient's going to be in trouble. And so we try to make sure that you get as much help as possible. And inpatient rehab, I mean, we'll talk about that. We will talk about doing family training, because again, that's a very key aspect to make sure that whoever is going to be involved with caring for that patient can really do the job. Because if we find that that is not the case, we may make the recommendation, okay, maybe going home may not be the best thing right now, and maybe going to a different facility where you can get care provided for you is going to be a better way to go. The other ways that we can do this, again, is following up outpatient visits and things like that, just checking in with the caregiver to make sure that everything is going well. Another aspect of is support groups. That's really key, because support groups allow caregivers to talk with other caregivers. One, if nothing else, to commiserate with one another if they are all having their issues. So at least they have that kind of emotional support. But also, it's a good way for caregivers then to sort of throw out ideas and figure out what works and what doesn't work. And then finally, really the other thing is that, what other financial resources that there may be, out in the community. And so, social work, at least on the inpatient rehab side, is very important, because they can help potentially identify, resources for those patients and caregivers to use to be able to provide the care, so that ultimately a patient does not end up in a nursing home in the long run, and can remain out in the community.
Yeah, I think that idea of not just the the support groups, not just as places where people can take care of their own mental wellness with others and share the experience, but the collaboration and the idea share of here's what's working for me. Because PM&R, physical therapists, occupational therapists, they're almost the front lines, but your family and your caregivers, your care team extends all the way to your home, and they'll see you every day. And they're really a wonderful advocate and resource for new ideas.
Yep. And what I find too is, because I do periodically, we have our support groups, and I do go talk with them periodically. And I've always find it amazing, because these are people who are not shy. They have questions and they are going to ask. And you try to you try to provide the information that they need, and give them, and give them the best reality that you can. And so it's really a lot of fun to do that.
Let's talk a little bit about new innovations within the care space. And we're a company focused on providing technology for both the analysis of movement as well as the augmentation of movement. We know that stroke is still occurring at about 800,000 new cases per year, but that we have decreased the mortality rate. So people are living post-stroke longer. what are the innovations that have helped to enable a higher quality of life, and what things are on the horizon that you're excited about mainstreaming into the care plans and rehab plans?
So let me start. I'm going to sort of backtrack just a teeny bit, if you don't mind, because in terms of some of the things on the acute care side, I've been very lucky over the years to, when TPA first came out, now thrombectomy, and now tweaking all these things to decide how far that, how far out you can actually do these things that can help patients. The interesting part is that, you're absolutely correct. It has decreased mortality. The problem, I guess, which unfortunately, keeps us in business, is the fact that you've shifted people who, may not necessarily live through this entire thing, and now may live and have a disability. And so we have to deal with all that. stuff. So there's a lot of stuff outside of conventional therapies that have been that been developed. There's a lot of technological stuff, the non-technological stuff. We have things like mental imagery, mirror therapy, bilateral arm therapy, constraint-induced movement therapy for the lower extremity. You have body weight support treadmill training, things along those lines. So a lot of that stuff is kind of there, and may use, at most maybe uses a treadmill and, a harness. But a lot of it really is just, good old fashioned therapy, with the therapist and the patient, and trying to do that. With the technological things that have come about, are really very fascinating. Of course, we have, things like virtual reality. There's been a lot of research, robotics, both upper and lower limb machinery that's being done. And then stuff like you've been working with, in terms of, being able to use potentially use brain computer interfaces, BCI. You have all these wonderful, technological advances that are being made. It's just going to be interesting. I think the whole idea, with really something like brain computer interfaces, is really trying to see how you can bypass the damage and actually get function again, as opposed to trying to get the brain to reorganize itself, but you're still limited as to what function the brain actually has.
So we talked about some of these new innovations, and something that have been incredibly passionate about for even longer than I've been working in this space is data-driven healthcare. And we know we're the amount of data that we're starting to be able to generate on humans and the human body, especially as integration of sensors into clothing and into devices that we carry around in our pocket, it becomes a deluge of data. And the idea of how do you turn that data into action? What are some of the data that you use within your practice? What data do you wish you had more access to be able to better help these patients?
Well, a lot of what we do is really in terms of functional data. So probably, I think the first and foremost on the inpatient side, to this point, we've been using a measure called the Functional Independence Measure, or the FIM, with Medicare, Medicaid, moving on to, we're now using the CARE tool, which is going to be more of a tool. Instead of inpatient rehab, it's supposed to measure function across the continuum of inpatient care, so into skilled nursing facilities and things along those lines. I'll be very frank, on the outpatient side, which is really where things are probably, more important for keeping patients out in the community. The kind of data that we have is not really great. And that's because the idea of, and the question of what is function, and function is many, many, many different things. And so how do you measure that? And I think it's really a matter of, what do you really want to measure? And it could be simple as, we can talk about, time not being in a nursing home or being at home, for example. Or you could, if it's for walking, it can be walking speed, or walking distance. But, as you can see, I mean, these are very, very, finite, very specific kinds of measures. There are some other, there are other measures that are probably a lot more global. Such, how satisfied are you, quality of life kinds of things. So, I mean, there's really, so from the functional standpoint, there is all that. And, when we're doing, research, sometimes it's really difficult to figure out what are the, what really are the most appropriate types of measures. I think one of the things, for example, in stroke has been spasticity, and really trying to correlate changes in spasticity with things like botulinum toxins or intrathecal baclofen or medications even. How do you translate that into function? And we have maybe one measure, but that one measure, the disability assessment scale, looks at 4 different types of functions, which includes pain. It may include range of motion. I mean, so it includes different types of impairment and measures and such. And again, not great, but but that's the best we have. So there's still a lot of work. One, there's a lot of work, but number 2, the idea of being able to measure these things ultimately becomes a toolbox. That you're really not going to have one thing, but the key of doing this is going to be with with good validated measures, that are standardized, and can be really used across the boards. And that's not necessarily that easy. And there are tons of them out there. Which ones do you specifically use? Tough choice to make sometimes. I think, in terms of, and then, with the kinds of things that, you work on, I mean, that's sort of the big data kind of thing, because, if you're looking at, trying to, for example, look at brain waves and trying to, decode these things to try to translate it into movement. I mean, that's a huge, it's a huge amount, because that's getting, readings from different parts of the brain, and then being able to figure out, how do they work in movement. And, however big, those data sets are, they're absolutely, tremendous. So we have that kind of data that we have to work with as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple different elements as I think about the opportunity around data. One of them being, if you can democratize in a de-identified and safe way the big data, the large sets of data, so that people who are really into the data science of it and the research of it can identify those specific biomarkers or specific functions that can be modulated. And we have been largely focused on the peripheral nervous system and the interaction of muscle firings, and being able to measure spasticity in real time, and both as a cause and the kinematic output as effect. And it came from our experience again of taking Sophia to a gait lab and having my daughter Sophia, strapped up with all of the sensors, and it took about an hour to set up, and she did like 5 steps across the force plates and 5 steps back, and got a report. And then you never saw any data on that again. And yes, it informed the care plan at that one moment, but I said, like, well, what if I can have that data all of the time? And then what if that data isn't just used in an analysis standpoint, but also used to power some neural augmentation? And so by combining that with functional electrical stimulation, which is what we do to make a closed loop system for a neural prosthesis, it can actually react to the environment. Because she would go to school, and yeah, in clinic, in rehab, they were working on her gait, but then there's people around, and there's obstacles, and there's just the context of it all is so different. And I really wanted to see if we could do something about understanding the humans as they are out in the community, as they are in the context of their daily lives, and then not only just have the data for information. I spent a lot of time in the data as information standpoint, but use that to power something that was actually helping them in real time.
Right. No, so from there, I mean, the big data is really, correlating what goes on out in the periphery with what goes on centrally, and trying to make some sense out of all of it, which is it's a big it's a big order to fill.
Yeah, well, it's cool because I do believe that neurology and understanding of the human brain is really coming into its own now, and there are some amazing companies working on it. We just saw this week the news from Neurallink with the monkey playing pong with his brain, and they starting with a sort of similar mission, which is to say, eventually this type of technology can be applicable to all humans, but let's start with the people who need it most, and they are focused on spinal cord injury and the BCI interface into machines. Have you looked at the Neuralink stuff? Interested in where they're going and applicability maybe to the communities that you're working with?
It's really interesting stuff. I mean, first of all, I mean, I think number one, I mean, just to say this is really a step in the right direction. I mean, the good news is that these kinds of interfaces have actually been around for a while. They've been around for like 20 years. So from that standpoint, nothing new, although the technology has really gotten a lot smaller. And then the one thing that they've done here is they've used more Bluetooth technology to make this wireless, which is probably, because everything else you've seen, people are connected up to wires and stuff like that, which obviously in the long run is not going to be a very practical way to do it. But I think it's very, very cool, that they've been able to get to this point, and start working on with at least with animals, and hopefully eventually with humans, to do this. And I totally agree with you. I mean, I think the low-hanging fruit will be with spinal cord injury, because at least you've got a normal brain to work with, and that's going to be the easiest thing to work with to start. Really, the holy grail is going to be figuring how, if at all possible, how do you work with brain injury patients who don't have everything available to them, and in addition, may not necessarily be their brains may not necessarily be as static. So for example, one of the things that we saw in a grand rounds probably a couple of years ago is from the Applied Physics Laboratory at Hopkins, where they're doing neuroprostheses, and they actually had somebody who can control a neuroprosthesis, just using their mind. But the issue that they basically said was that for some of these things, trying to get everything in sync so that it will work properly is a major task. And how that's going to work, down the future, in the future, and how we're going to be able to put that all together. I mean, hopefully artificial intelligence will be able to answer some of those questions. But even so, I mean, it's an interesting but very difficult question to answer.
Yeah, I do think that there's been some exciting innovations in control systems and machine learned algorithms, and the productization of all of that, right? So I started my career working in machine learning in the late 90s. And we used to have to build all these things by hand, right? You're building these hand-tuned models, and now you have all this infrastructure to just take care. What you have to go do is get all the well-labeled data, and you can turn a crank. And I think what drove a lot of that recently in complex systems around autonomous vehicles and those systems, which there's only one company that I've seen that's doing real, true sort of end-to-end AI. All the rest of them are doing sort of machine learned, verticalized system with a lot of checks and balances. You talk about speed of coordination, and I think it is. You think about just what is an often taken for granted skill of walking. How many muscles groups are being fired in coordination with one another? And that's our main area of focus, is on gait. And you're really trying to coordinate a bunch of systems together in milliseconds, right? Milliseconds of time. So I do think that we have an opportunity to, and And I'm hopeful as I see more and more companies taking on human scale innovation and clinical innovation, that they're embracing the research community and working with them to bring the best of both worlds together. Because it's not often happened prior to this, where you have true research getting commercialized with true, industrialization skill sets, and bringing those together is a challenge always.
No, absolutely. No, I totally agree. Absolutely. And it's where, it is where the universities or the National Institutes of Health are, really can come together with industry to, help move these things forward.
Yeah, we, one of the things that we've been trying to do with our system is not just build a single product, but build a platform. And in that process, we've been engaging with different universities to try and take some of their research and invention and bring it out. Because one of the big challenges that they all say is like, I'm sure the folks that you were talking to are doing the neuroprosthesis, same thing is like, you spend so much time just building the hardware, right? And that's not, if everybody's rebuilding the same hardware, you're not getting that scale, the same sort of scale that came from cloud data centers for the software world. Now we can do that. You really want to democratize access to the human body. What innovations can be inspired there?
No, I agree. And also being able to use, ultimately being able to use, as I like to call it, the original equipment, as opposed to having to deal with the prosthesis, is really, I think, going to be an amazing thing if we can accomplish it.
Yeah, well, and that's, I mean, outside of their very personal connection to brain injury that is cerebral palsy, just the idea that with a lightweight, soft exoskeleton, or a sensor-enabled and garment, and the stimulation-enabled garment, you can take advantage of existing musculoskeletal strength. And it is about coordinating those pathways. And if we can, like you said, bypass the damage, or read in one side and write on the other, there's an opportunity to hopefully in a very low footprint, be able to give them greater mobility and freedom.
No, and that's it. And then, again, that's one of the other holy grails that I think you're working on so well, is trying to make this stuff so that, patients who are, who have weakness to begin with can actually, wear and tolerate these things, to a much better degree than you might be able to now.
Yeah, and it feels like it's just a million small things, right? It's as you said, BCIs have been around for a long time, and the innovation that's happening now, one is being able to pack a lot into a small space, so miniaturization, the power of speed to do these rapid iterations on small timescales, and it's all these little things that go from something that can work once to something that works on a wide swath of all of these individuals who we've talked about, and also gives them an opportunity to engage in different ways into their own rehab, which we said at the beginning was such a key, is a critical advantage as we move forward into.
No, and that's true. And I think with these things, I mean, they will serve really two purposes. I think one, the functional purpose is certainly very important, but then, and that's more in the compensatory realm. The other one is the facilitation realm of what can you do with these things that actually might help, improve function, of the patient themselves.
Yeah, we have talked about sort of this. We talk about the continuum of abilities, right? Say I never be as smart as Stephen Hawking or as fast as Usain Bolt. That we're all on this continuum. Now there's very binary words like disability, which I think that they short sell the complexity and the nuance and what those people are highly able to do. And so if we think of the aspirational of being able to move everybody up that continuum, where comes the point when someone's like, well, I'm going to use the same technology as something that was maybe previously, in the Neurallink case for spinal cord injury patients, I'm going to use it because it gives me a function that's beyond existing human capabilities, not just replacing something that has been taken away, but exceeding human potential, which I think is one of the if we, when we think about that it's inspiring us to go and push further and think further.
No, and that, yeah, I mean, so it really can serve a couple of purposes for the disabled community, as well as hopefully, maybe the abled community in the future. But again, we'll see where this takes us.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to ask just sort of as a last question, back to resources for those who have recently suffered a stroke, caregivers who are, where would you point them? Where should they go look for more information on sort of best practices and new forms of care?
Probably to me, I mean, from the work I've done and others, I mean, the American Stroke Association website, which is on the platform stroke.org, is a great place to start. We have a lot of professional as well as lay people resources out there. So I think that's a great place to get some information. There is a stroke warm line. So if any stroke survivors need help, there's a place actually they can call, that they can talk to somebody and help and hopefully get some of the help that they need. Other places, I mean, looking at locally, looking at, say, your local, if you have a rehab hospital nearby, chances are there's a stroke support group that's associated with it. And that's often a good place, again, as we talked about earlier, to be able to get together with other stroke survivors as well as caregivers, for that emotional support, education, as well as other resources that might be available there. So I think those are probably the two best places. I know there are some websites out there for national stroke support groups. So those are probably the two best places I would start.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for this conversation. It was really a lot of fun. We hit a lot of topics, and thank you for all of the work that you are doing in the space to further the quality of care for stroke survivors and other brain injuries. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun. And again, thanks for inviting me.
That's all for this episode of Superpowering the Human Body. Thank you for listening. You can subscribe to our podcast on SoundCloud or YouTube. Until next time, this has been Superpowering the Human Body.